Welcome to today's webinar. This is one that's had a huge sign up, very similar to the kind of audience that joined us back in August when we were talking about the fact that the GDPR had gone past its 5th birthday, and we were reviewing what that meant in terms of the last 5 years and how data protection legislation had impacted over the 5 years. So today we're going to be talking more about compliance and what that looks like, and are you compliant, and giving you some sort of ideas and suggestions as to whether you might be, or maybe you might need to sort of do some work. We're going to be focusing on current legislation, privacy culture in business. We've talked about culture in lots of our webinars because it is so important to privacy and data security and cyber security. We'll focus on some common myths and misconceptions that relate to compliance in around this area. We'll focus briefly on electronic marketing because that's an important subject, I'm sure, for many of you. And then we'll look to the future, although that will be slightly speculative to some extent because we don't know what's yet to come, but we have a pretty good idea, I think, what we might expect to see. And then we'll focus some time on something you may or may not heard of, which is the UK Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, which is making its way through the House of Lords at the moment. So we'll give you an update on that, and then what does it actually mean tangibly to your organization. So I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Meagan Mirza today, who's a Senior Data Protection Officer with Moore ClearComm. Meagan's joined me on many webinars over the last 12 months, and her insights are always really welcome, and the expertise is fantastic, and it's all in a plain English fashion, which suits me down to the ground. So welcome, Meagan. Would you guys just give us a bit of a brief intro in terms of your background and what you do for us?
Sure, and hi Rich, and welcome everyone. Hopefully you'll all find this session useful and engaging, and yes, we will be keeping it very simple and straightforward in terms of what you need to be thinking about. In terms of my background, I've been working with Moore ClearComm for the last couple of years, doing outsourced data protection work as advisory, as a data protection officer, dealing with clients and organizations within the UK and further afield across Europe and other countries like the States, for example. In terms of my background, I worked for the Information Commissioner's Office for 12 years. So I was there when the GDPR came into force, and was very much involved with the drafting of the Data Protection Act, or advising on the drafting and issues and potential issues with that. I was surrounded by the chaos that was as the new legislation came into play, particularly all the queries coming in from organizations at that time, and producing guidance and going out and doing training and sessions for organizations. More recently, worked in central government in data protection team within the Ministry of Justice. And then, as I said, I've been more recently doing outsourced consultancy work around data protection. So thanks, Rich, and that's me.
Brilliant, thanks, Meagan. And yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, with a background like that, such value to the Moore ClearComm team and our clients. And I think, yeah, we're only a few days away, aren't we, from the 6th anniversary? So time really has flown by. So one thing to mention at this point: the webinar that we ran on a similar topic back in August, we had an unprecedented amount of questions. We couldn't answer them all during the session, but we did provide the responses to every single question when we gave all of the audience copies of the slide deck. So we'll do that again. However, if you do have questions for Meagan or I at any stage from this point on, please feel free to drop us an email direct, and then we'll do our very best to answer those questions, or either provide you with support if that's what you need, or signpost you in the right direction. So we'll start with a review of current legislation. And this is a roadmap, the exact same roadmap that we put up on the screen back in August, Meagan, in terms of how we've got to where we are today. Would you be able to just sort of talk us through your view of how this journey over the last sort of 22 years? And I'm not going to ask you to give me 22 years of history, but
No.
just to talk us through, and yeah, how that's kind of played out.
Yeah.
Really.
So again, keeping it at a fairly simple level, there are 3 pieces of legislation currently in the UK, which is essentially the umbrella of data protection legislation. So we have what we call PECA, the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations. So they've been in force since 2003. We have GDPR, or UK GDPR now, since Brexit. And alongside UK GDPR, we have the Data Protection Act. primary bits of the legislation will apply differently to different organizations, but essentially PECA covers marketing, direct marketing and cookies, and we will touch on some of that. GDPR, or UK GDPR, is primarily the legislation you look to in terms of looking at compliance. The Data Protection Act, which sits alongside it, is where you will see some of the more detailed provisions around exemptions and stuff like that. So all I'd say is you don't need to be overly exercised with the Data Protection Act as long as you're focused on the provisions within the UK GDPR in terms of compliance. And we've got some changes coming this year, and we will talk about those because they are going to be making amendments to the legislation, which will make it even more UK specific. So we will talk about those when we're talking about the future.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And this, I don't know if it's been your experience, but my experience has been for many years that when we talk to potential clients or general businesses, if we're at exhibitions or conferences, quite often they'll refer to data protection as GDPR. So which is quite interesting because obviously that legislation hasn't been around that long. So what I think it did do was achieve the fact that data protection became more of a mainstream subject for the average business, to the point where they think GDPR is per se data protection. So, but there's so much more to it than that, obviously, and we'll cover a lot of that today. And yeah, like you said, we'll cover what's going to be coming in the future with the bill, and not too far ahead. So, in terms of, I tapped into Meagan's experience when we were putting these slides together in terms of the common areas of vulnerability. So these would be the areas that would potentially render your organization non-compliant, and with some action therefore needed. So what we've got here, and I'll ask Meagan to talk about it in a bit more depth and sort of examples perhaps, but typically what we find is that these are the sort of areas that where organizations fall down. I think that's right to say, isn't it, Meagan? And the sorts of things that maybe in the moment, such as a breach, they don't handle it that well or properly, or their kind of proactive work hasn't been substantial enough in terms of how they manage data and records. So is that kind of what we're looking at as typical examples?
Absolutely. So that's where I'm working with organizations, and that's where it quickly unravels. So when there's an incident, and it may not even be the most serious of incidents, but so for example, an email going off to the wrong address, and it normally happens late Friday afternoon. So you are looking at the organization saying, what do we do? So we then have to look at what was in the email, how sensitive was it, what type of data was in there, that type of thing. But they often don't even have reporting lines internally to even know how to manage that. So how do you investigate it? Who's responsible for it? Who makes decisions around whether you need to report it to the regulator if it's really serious, for example? But it all starts to unravel in terms of then you start looking, well, what sort of training have staff had? How do you hold your records? How has that happened that you've sent a massive, really sensitive attachment to a member of the public, listing all your staff's salaries, for example? And so all your processes really quickly start to unravel when you have an incident. And as I said, it may not necessarily be really serious, but it quickly becomes apparent that staff are really unaware of what to do when that happens. So you often get people running around waving their hands saying we don't know what to do. And that's what you really want to try and avoid. You want to have clear processes and procedures in place, and staff being aware of what to do.
Yeah, I suppose the consistent theme there, I think, is when we have this experience, don't we, where organizations have this misconception that having all of the policy documents in place and making sure they're up to date, but then putting them on a shelf to gather dust, that's when that's proven to be inadequate practice. So, and it's the same with business continuity planning. The best plans in the world fall down if they're not testing it, or if people aren't aware of actually what to do. So that kind of rings true. And I think also you mentioned right at the start that late on a Friday afternoon, and that's definitely what I would call the red zone for, as you said, the accidental stuff with emails going to the wrong people, but it's also the red zone for the most likely time that people will fall for a phishing attack. And we're not talking about cybersecurity today, but it's that human side of data protection and cybersecurity. It's when we're at our weakest, we're maybe rushing a bit. It's been a tiring week, and that's when ordinarily it's very consistent. We see that Friday afternoon, or maybe just before you're about to go on holiday. is also a similar sort of time. So it just shows that those human areas. So I think this is a really useful slide for today's audience, because if anything gets taken away from today, it's these 5 areas. You will get a copy of the slides afterwards, to maybe take a bit of a microscopic look at this stuff in your organization and think, oh, have we got the right policies and procedures in place, but also, more importantly, do people know what to do when these things happen? And I think data subject access requests, fair to say that people underestimate how much time and effort are needed when they come in?
Absolutely. So you have organizations that have 30 or even more requests coming in every month, and they sort of have this factory line process in terms of dealing with them, and that's fine. But then you have organizations that perhaps have never had one, and they might have, for example, a disgruntled ex-member of staff who all of a sudden makes a subject access request, and that can bring down a team for quite a long time in terms
Yeah,
of looking at what data you hold, whether any exemptions apply. The whole thing might be a bit contentious if there's an employment tribunal going on in the background, for example. So one request can really floor a team and really take out a lot of resource and time if you don't have the right processes in place. And that also links into records management, knowing what you hold, where you hold it, and where you have to go if you do get a request for disclosure or a subject
yeah,
access request. So that's all around management, but culture as well, in terms of having those
yes,
processes in place.
yeah, definitely. Something I should have said at the start, if someone does have a really burning question about something they see on a screen in that moment, please feel free to ask the question. We will
Yeah.
be monitoring the questions. We'll do our best to answer them. We'll sort of judge in that moment whether we can answer it succinctly in the time we've got. So yeah, please don't hold back. All other questions we'll deal with as we go forward. So we've almost kind of talked a little bit about privacy culture, because that is very much underpinning the last slide, is that people element. We talk about culture in cybersecurity as well. It's a very common theme. A fantastic quote here from James Heskett of Harvard Business School, and something that I know I think both of us have a real focus on, the importance of leadership. And it really is the single most important element in determining success, because if you can have all the best policies and procedures and philosophies in the world, but if it's not lived and breathed by the leadership team or the person at the very top of the business, it becomes very difficult to implement and to maintain those high standards. And we're talking about core values as well. So very important that to develop a really genuine, robust privacy culture, that leadership invests in that, and that lives by those values. So that's a great quote from James Heskett. Um, so a bit of an open question for us both, really, and this is based on our experience, where things work well and where they maybe don't work so well. Meagan, is a strong culture key to achieving a position of compliance, and how important is the role of that leader? And maybe um, where it doesn't work if a leader isn't invested.
Yeah. So I've had examples of both, where you've got really strong leaders that are really engaged and proactive and really keen to get all this embedded in practice and accept the risk, because there are humans involved here, and you
Yeah,
will always have some sort of incident or some issue going on in terms of data protection. The important thing is how you manage that, and having that role, that leadership buy-in is absolutely integral to all of this. In extreme examples, I've worked with really hardworking teams on the ground that are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to get the policies and procedures in place. They just have zero interest at a senior level within those organizations. And that is going to come a cropper if there's an incident or if there's an audit. So the ICO could possibly come in and do an audit of the organization. And that will all fall down when we're looking at governance, because that's one of the key factors that is looked at when there's an assessment or an audit being undertaken.
yeah,
So it's really important for the leader of the organization, whether it be the CEO or something similar, to understand why it's important, and to buy into the whole process and to have that chain of reporting going up to that senior level. And that will become more important under the new changes coming about with the new legislation, which we will
yeah.
talk about. But that senior level buy-in is really integral and part of being a compliant organization. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my experience as well. And I think where we accept that organizations have hierarchy, you know, you have those at the top, for want of a better phrase, and those that are just joined an organization, for the purpose of privacy and cybersecurity and the culture around it, I think you need to have an almost flat structure where the most junior person in the business feels confident and empowered to challenge the most senior person, and
Yeah.
to just question in a positive and proactive way behaviors, or to point out things. And you, so because if you have those barriers between the levels in the hierarchy, things fall down pretty quickly when it comes to privacy. And from a practical perspective, it's very common, and it's actually a type of social engineering attack that specifically focuses on leadership teams within an organization, because the attackers know that impersonating a leader is more likely to increase the chances of the staff doing the wrong thing. So leadership is key, I think. And like I
Yeah.
said, I've had good and bad examples, and I've had a personal experience a few years ago now, in very early days of when 2018, I think mid 2018, where the leader in the organization I was with at the time actually did the wrong things after a breach because he wanted to protect his organization. So that's important, I think, to factor into this, isn't it? Is that they may have an emotional or financial investment that differs, and therefore maybe do the wrong things to try and protect the organization, perhaps. That's
Yeah.
certainly what I experienced in those couple of days.
I mean, we're seeing that with the post office inquiry
Yeah, good
going on at the
example.
moment. It's
Yeah.
not so much about well, it is about personal data, I guess, but
Yeah.
we are seeing that sort of culture of cover up sort of
Yeah.
coming out there as
Yeah.
well.
I
Yeah.
think the most important phrase for me when it comes to culture is do the right thing. It's only
Yeah.
4 words, but it's so powerful. And if you always have that in mind, stick it up on the wall, whatever you want to do. But it's just a good reminder to us all, really. Some very interesting, useful stats from different sources. So from some stats from a stat from Built In, 88% of employees believe a strong company culture is key to business success. And I think that certainly with cybersecurity in particular, uh, they can add value to the success potential of an organization. This isn't just about compliance; it can add benefits. So culture is key to business success. Gallup reported that 84% of the value of a company comes from the talent, skills, knowledge, work ethic, and health of its employees. So people are at the core of all this stuff when it comes to culture. And Pareto Labs reported that an inspired employee is up to 125% more productive than a satisfied one. So all of this cultural focus comes with that important focus at the top. And I think a very useful graphic from various research sources that I could find is that there are kind of 5 elements to a strong culture. And I think it's fair to say, Meagan, that all of these 5 factors are essential to data privacy, good cybersecurity practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
Embedding that
transparency,
into
I
an
guess, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, it is, and it's embedding that into the organization. And that helps build businesses because you then develop that trust with the people you're dealing with, and people like engaging with you. And so your business does build on this as well. So it's not just about data protection, it's not just about
No.
cyber, it's about building up your reputation, your brand, and it's all part of that
Yeah.
development. Yeah.
I think we're at that point in time where cybersecurity and data protection, data privacy are fixed costs of running an effective and successful business. Um, it's not a nice to have. It was never a nice to have, but now it's an absolute fundamental. And the organizations that you do business with or who you want to contract with are increasingly more focused on making sure that you, as part of their supply chain, can prove that you have a genuine focus on privacy and security. So it's only going in the right direction. In terms of building a strong privacy culture, I think it's so important to understand the importance of privacy, not just from a legislative perspective, because we're talking about compliance today, but the ethics and the importance of privacy. Um, Defining your core values and your missions. One of those missions, as I've just mentioned, should be data privacy and privacy by design. So it's not just about IT; it's about the human understanding of data privacy. Something that Meagan's involved in a lot, and maybe can touch on in a second, is that investment in awareness and best practice training, but also supported by the IT and the technical controls. Clarity and consistency from the leadership team we've mentioned already. Recognition is so important, building culture and engaging employees. And I don't just mean celebrating the successes, but if you do have that most junior person in the business that calls out a potential breach or a
Yeah.
potential that, even if it's not correct and it proves that it wasn't a breach, the fact they've had that, they're comfortable in raising their hand is fantastic, and that evidence evidence is good culture. And then that positive reinforcement and celebration of best practice. I think you have to talk about this subject in such a positive way. But could you just touch on the importance of awareness training, Meagan, and how
Yeah,
that, and maybe not just what you would talk about, but the importance of keeping that as a constant?
yeah, absolutely. So, and often I don't just talk about training, it's around awareness raising. So
Mm,
when I'm working with an organization, and often they'll have some basic e-learning package that staff do maybe on induction or fairly regularly, maybe every year or something like that. And that's fine as your baseline in terms of just understanding the legislation. What I'll do is go into an organization then and do quite specific what I'll call awareness raising sessions. So it might be if it's a charity, to their board of trustees, or a senior leadership in another organization. So tackle it that from the top. So do a sort of slightly different session for that leadership team, really talking about the importance of their role in terms of embedding this in practice. And then we'll do awareness raising sessions for staff that brings it to life. So, talks about case studies, talks about why it's important and how they can be part of that process. So that's for me, it's bringing it to life and seeing and getting people to understand why this is important, and that point around transparency, people being confident to say, actually, oh no, I have sent that email to the wrong address, we need to do something about it
yeah.
immediately, that type of thing. So yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. And as you said, we with all of our clients, we focus more in depth with the leadership team because that's appropriate, and but everyone in the business should benefit. E-learning has its place, but sometimes I think it falls into making sure that a box is ticked as opposed to the actual tangible benefit. So I think it's just to be mindful of falling into that trap there, I think. So um, we've talked about this, I think, before in previous webinars, but it's always good to review myths and misconceptions because they still float about, even though we're six years into what, I mean, obviously we talk about the GDPR from a 2016 perspective, but for the average person in business on the street, 2018 was the year, wasn't it, that people became aware of it. So I'll pop them up on screen. You can give a brief response to each one. So the GDPR no longer applies post-Brexit.
So technically, that's probably true because the EU GDPR is no longer relevant for the UK. So we have the UK GDPR. As it stands, it's broadly the same article numbers and all the rest of it, but we are going to see the UK moving away from that. So yes, I'm afraid data protection law still applies, but we call it UK GDPR in the UK.
Brilliant, thank you. We need consent to process personal data. Now, this is something that I heard a lot in the early stage of 2018. I think this was, you might agree or disagree, this was the strongest message, I think, that was being pushed out across media, or when you went to exhibitions or conferences. This was the one that I heard the most.
And it's still the one that people sort of get slightly fixated with as being the
Mm,
right thing to do. Actually, it's not, and it is a really challenging legal basis to rely on. One of the things with consent, I would always say to an organization, is if the processing is necessary for you as an organization, then consent is not going to be the right legal basis because people
okay.
can refuse to consent, they can withdraw their consent. And consent needs to be quite particular and specific. So individuals need to be fully informed in terms of what they're consenting to. So in terms of even managing that, that can be quite challenging, and keeping it under review to make sure that they still consent in 2 years' time, for example, to the same thing. So it brings with it some challenges. There are other legal bases that organizations can rely on that still give people their rights. You're not taking away their rights, so they can object to some of those, for example. But consent is not the be all and end all in terms of a legal basis. And I'd always say, just think about whether that's the most appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you are unsure about a lawful basis for activities, as I said, you've got our contact details through the webinar. You might have them already. Please reach out. This one's a really interesting one, isn't it? Data protection stops us from sharing data.
And we've seen many cases over the years, particularly horrific cases where, for example, children have been killed or something along those lines, really horrific cases where the organization will often say, well, we didn't tell people about the concerns we had because of data protection. And we've seen it in the policing context, and we've seen it in many other areas. Data protection does not stop you from sharing data. What it offers you is a framework to make sure that you are sharing data in a compliant way and that it is necessary, and you build on that. So in all the years I've been working in data protection, I've not come across many examples of where it is inappropriate to share. So mostly you'd be looking at, yes, it's okay to share, but we need to think about, why are we sharing? What do we need to share? And have it underpinned in an agreement possibly, or something along those lines. So it doesn't
Yeah.
stop you from sharing. It gives you a framework to make sure that you're doing it appropriately.
Yeah, and it's concerning, isn't it? And that that in certain scenarios, we've reached that kind of perverse state where legislation would lead us to a decision that is clearly ethically and morally not the right one, and it's not doing the right thing. But our focus on, or fear of, repercussions through legislation would actually cause that to happen. So, yeah,
There
again,
was an
yeah,
example. I was
go
just
on,
going to,
sorry.
sorry, Rich. I was just going to say there was a recent example I just saw on LinkedIn this weekend where someone was at a big event, and their children had gone missing, and the organizers refused to say over the loudspeaker, in terms of the names of the children,
Mm,
saying that GDPR stopped them from doing that. So
right.
there's still a lot of misunderstanding out there in terms
Yeah.
of
Yeah,
these
for
things,
sure.
and you do shake your head at some of these things where they say
Yeah.
GDPR says no.
Yeah. I guess
Yeah.
it's similar to the scenario, isn't it? Where if you come across someone in the street who needs CPR, that some people would not do it because for the repercussions afterwards. So, yeah, it's concerning sometimes, isn't it? Um, the GDPR only applies to bigger organizations.
So again, it's UK GDPR in the UK. It applies to any organisation that's processing personal data. So it doesn't matter how big or how small you are. If you
No.
are processing personal data, you need to be compliant with the legislation.
Yeah. We're going to focus on this in a bit more depth, but we can send electronic marketing without consent.
Not in every case. So we will talk about that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
direct marketing, yeah, it's a big sort of area in and of itself, but broadly speaking, you cannot send direct marketing to individual subscribers without their consent.
Yeah. Now, this definitely
Uh,
was the view in the early stages of 2018, and you would have experienced that from an ICO perspective, I guess. And the reporting was extensive, wasn't it? Every data
yeah.
breach needs to be reported to the ICO.
Yes, and I was at the ICO at that time,
Mm.
and you felt as though you had to put your hands up against the door to stop them coming in. Yeah, so that has slowly developed in terms of organizations understanding what the threshold is in terms of reporting to the ICO, but I still think they are receiving many thousands of breach reports every year.
Yeah.
Um, and some may not meet the threshold of being needing to be reported, but actually in a lot of cases, if you're not sure, I think you're better off to report than not.
Yeah.
Um, and because most cases will come out as no further action, and maybe with some recommendations,
Mm.
something along those lines, rather than ending up in a fine or a reprimand.
Yeah. I guess as a kind of loose analogy, it's a bit similar to, the high percentage of people that go to A&E, they don't need to, and I think it's just in case, isn't it? So
Yeah.
people report just in case. And often, I think that's, maybe I might be wrong, Meagan, but the pressure also comes from those that have maybe they've been sent this stuff accidentally to say you need to report that. So it's
Yes,
it's
that
about having
often
the
happens.
confidence and the level of awareness and understanding to say no, actually,
Yeah.
it's not reportable, which isn't easy sometimes.
Yeah.
Every data breach results in a fine or action.
So I've just touched on that. The majority of breaches, no, they don't. As I said, it might be no further action, maybe with some recommendations in terms of improving practices.
Mm,
It may nowadays be a reprimand for the more serious cases we're tending to see coming out of the
yeah,
ICO. Um, Rarely seeing fines coming out nowadays, although that's not to
no,
say it's off the cards, but there's certainly a slowing down of the fining activity in the UK. So,
yeah,
but even a reprimand is a naming and shaming exercise to a certain extent, and it will be
yeah,
publicised, and can impact if you're a small organization or a small business in terms
Sure.
of your reputation.
Yeah, I was going to say reputational damage is often more damaging than a
Yeah.
fine. And for those of who were lucky enough to join us back in October, we spent a bit of time focusing on the different countries around Europe and the level and regularity of their fines. So, for instance, in the UK, you're statistically far less likely, for instance, to suffer a financial penalty than if you're in Spain, for example, which is way ahead of anyone else. And so it does vary. And I think does that come down from interpretation of the rules, Meagan, or is
It's
that down to the way that the supervising authorities are set up?
it's more down to the approach of the supervisory authority in that particular
Okay.
country. So some are a bit more hardline than others.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it can be difficult to predict whether when you report something, particularly in another country, which I've been working with organizations to do, it's very difficult to predict whether you're going to get a fine or no further action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And this touches a little bit, doesn't it, on producing a load of policies and putting them on the shelf. GDPR compliance is a one-time exercise.
So I would say it's an ongoing process. I don't think, and frankly, I don't think anyone will ever be 100% compliant. But as I said, it's an ongoing process. So, on one day you might be able to say, yes, we've got all the processes and policies, etc., in place. We've done staff training and all the rest of it, but there will be possibly some other gaps there that you may not have plugged and it may not come
Yeah.
to light. So it's keeping it under review. It's an ongoing process in terms of compliance, and
Yeah.
things change. The legislation changes, as we're going to talk about,
Mm.
and so it needs to be kept under review.
We often, I think, don't we? We will come across websites, company websites, then they'll state we are GDPR compliant. So, what's your view on that when you read something like that?
And often you'll see when the date of it was, and it'll be like 2018 or something, and
Yeah.
it hasn't been
Yeah.
updated since then. So
Yes.
on a general level, I would say your policies, processes, your privacy notices on your website should be reviewed every 12 months and
Mm.
updated. People change roles, so different points of contact, maybe, things change. So you really should be keeping them under review every 12 months. And as
Yeah.
I said, it's that ongoing compliance check and
Yes. Yeah.
keeping everything up to date.
Yeah. And I suppose you're only as good as in the moment, aren't you? Good as your last game, as they say. And we're going to touch on this in more depth. But according to the new data protection bill, we won't need a DPO anymore, so we don't need to worry about data protection.
Yeah, so there's some slight changes around that. It's effectively a name change, I think it's fair to
Mm.
say, but
Yeah.
we will talk about that when we're talking about the future.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks, Meagan. So we'll briefly touch on electronic marketing. PECA sits alongside the Data Protection Act and UK GDPR, as Meagan said right at the beginning of today's webinar, and it gives people specific privacy rights in relation to electronic communications with rules on marketing calls, emails, texts, and faxes. Don't see many faxes these days, I guess. Cookies and similar technologies, keeping comms services secure, and customer privacy in relation to traffic and location data, itemized billing, line identification, and directory listing. So just maybe a brief sort of view of PECA, Meagan, would be good.
Yeah, so for most organizations and for you on the call, the most relevant bits will be the direct marketing provisions and the cookies. So I'll just touch on cookies.
Mm.
Cookies are that's where you get consent popping up on your website. So you have to provide consent and enable people to consent to non-essential cookies if you are using non-essential cookies, such as analytical cookies on your website. The reason being, broadly speaking, it's basically analyzing behaviors. So some of these cookies, the analytical cookies, are able to, for example, tell how long you stayed on a page for, whether you clicked on any links. And so it's essentially monitoring behavior. Equally, if you have those type of things in emails going out to clients, again, they could be tracking whether someone opens the email, how long they read it for, whether they click on any link. So it is effectively monitoring behavior, and that's why
Mm.
you need to have consent for those non-essential cookies.
Yeah.
it replicates itself, I guess, to a certain extent with direct marketing. If you are sending direct marketing communications, and that can be quite a wide definition as well. It's not just about selling stuff. It could be talking about your aims and ideals as an organization, for example. That comes under the definition of direct marketing. And it is around targeting individual subscribers. So talking about sending emails to individuals' personal email addresses is where Pekka comes into play. If you are sending emails to business, for example, Pekka is not relevant. It only talks about individual subscribers. It does get slightly confusing, but GDPR or UK GDPR will apply to those company business to business emails, but not Pekka.
Right.
So you don't necessarily need consent for business to business emails.
Okay.
Hopefully I've made that clear.
Yeah, yeah, you have. And a misconception I think that I come across is, so just to put it into context, like, I'm guessing that every organization that's attended today's webinar will have a website, and they will have likely an external provider that built or hosts that website for them. So the misconception that I come across is that it's the web hosting company that looks after their website. They look after this stuff for us, so therefore it's their responsibility. That's not true, is it?
No, that's right. And you need to be aware of what non-essential cookies you've got operating on your website, because you need to tell
Mhm.
people about it,
Yeah,
and you need to be transparent with it. So most websites will have some sort of cookie policy or some information on there around the use of cookies, but you need to be transparent so you can get people to, or ask people to consent to the use of non-analytical cookies,
yeah,
such as Google Analytics or something like that. And most websites do have Google Analytics sitting in the background. So you need to
yeah.
be across what your website's doing and make sure people are aware of that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Meagan. And again, any questions on this one, please ask us. More than happy to help. So, a bit of a gaze into the future at this stage, and what that might look like. I think we all have sort of ideas about, what we absorb from the media, etc. A really intuitive quote here, I think, from Nicholas Bostrom, who's a philosopher in existential risk and human enhancement ethics. I said that better than I thought I would. Machine intelligence is the last invention that humanity will ever need to make, which is quite a powerful statement, isn't it? And with so much media focus on AI and the use of AI in business, it's been around for a long time in terms of machine learning and AI, but it feels like, to me anyway, that it's become suddenly mainstream newsworthy in the last sort of 2 to 3 years. But in terms of compliance and legislation around the future, this is pretty much the list, I think, Meagan, that we were looking at back in August, isn't it? It hasn't changed too much. We won't run through them in too much depth, but the one that I think stands out probably a little bit is the Artificial Intelligence Regulation Act for the EU. So we're going to focus on that in a moment, but just maybe a brief sort of summary of what we're looking at here and what this means, I guess, from a data
Yeah.
protection perspective.
So I guess what we'd like to achieve really is for you all to go away and just be thinking, actually, there are some changes coming that
Yes.
possibly may impact on our organization or on our business.
Yeah.
So we have at the moment the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill going through Parliament. It's in the House of Lords at the moment. I should stop calling it the dippity doo-dah, but that it's essentially going to make amendments to the data protection legislation in the UK. It's predicted to pass at the end of July, before summer recess. So we're still not 100% sure whether that's actually going to be the case, but most experts in this area are saying that that's likely to be the case.
Yeah.
Some provisions within the legislation will come into effect straight away. So we need to be mindful of that. Some will take longer. Some may take 12 to 18 months to allow organizations to prepare themselves for the changes, similar to what happened when UK GDPR came into force.
Yeah.
So we will talk about some of the provisions that are in terms of changes. There's been quite a lot of, in terms of international transfers, there's been quite a lot going on in terms of adequacy and who it's okay to share data with for any international transfers. Particularly in terms of the US, we now have the data privacy framework in play. So if you are working with an organization in the United States, you should check whether they're on the data privacy framework list. And if they are on that list, that means that it is safe to transfer personal data across to that particular organization. what we're finding is a lot of the big software as a service provider. So if you're using a particular platform, for example, a lot of those big software agencies are registered now on the data privacy framework. So that means that you don't need to do a lot of the things that you may have been having to do in terms of a transfer. So it's taken away a lot of the bureaucracy, and it's given you peace of mind that you would be okay to transfer data to them. Rich has just touched on AI. We're obviously seeing legislation in the EU that's not replicated here. We are getting a lot of guidance coming out from the UK's regulator, the ICO, on the use of AI. All I'd say from a data protection perspective is if you are looking at using AI in your organization, strip it back to basics and look at what's the purpose of doing that, what are the risks of doing that, how are we going to do that, and how are we going to tell people that we're doing what we're going to do. Are we impacting significantly on individuals by using this? In what context? So you might use it in a HR context in terms of making initial decisions around applicants, for example. That's where we're starting to see it happen quite a bit. So as I said, it's stripping it back to basics and look at actually what are you trying to achieve and how are we going to do that. Links into that next point. And then we're seeing quite a bit around facial recognition technology, and that whole area is developing very quickly. And again, if you are looking at using that type of technology, you need to be very careful because it's very easy to be non-compliant when using that type of tech. So again, you would need advice on that from data protection people.
Definitely,
if you are looking to do that.
I think the thing that sort of stands out for me as you're talking there is from a UK GDPR perspective and going back to 2018, a lot of focus on thinking about automated decision making and profiling. But I think what the focus and widespread generic use of AI is doing is maybe leading organizations a bit blindfold into that trap where they maybe don't even realize they're doing it and therefore falling foul. So is that kind of what we're relating to here a bit?
Yeah, and what I'm starting to see is organizations are putting together policies around the use of AI within their organization, ironically often drafted using AI. But we are starting to see that. So organizations are really thinking about this and how they can control it in terms of staff using it as well, because that can be quite a
Of
risk.
course. Of course, yeah. So let's focus a bit on it in terms of what the EU is doing. And I think it's fair to say that if you ask most people to kind of describe a visual representation of AI, they're going to be thinking about Terminator, or they're going to be thinking about people's jobs disappearing, and that's the fear. But in terms of the focus of the Act, it's more, as Meagan's kind of alluded to, about the business behaviors and how that's impacting, and the fact that we can very quickly rush into this stuff, perhaps without realizing what we're doing. So what it's trying to do, and the EU is trying to do, is to establish obligations for organizations, providers, and users in the use of these tools, and to focus on what they would deem to be unacceptable risks, such as cognitive behavioral manipulation of people or vulnerable groups, social scoring, and that's something I think we're alluding to, isn't it, with the automated decision making and profiling based on behaviors, socioeconomic status, or personal characteristics. And again, just mentioned the facial recognition, so real-time remote biometrics. So there's a lot more to this act than what we're putting on the screen, obviously. So it would be well worth, I think, people just researching what the EU Act looks like, not because to familiarize yourself extensively, but to just get maybe a theme and a flavor of the things that are causing concern and the obligations. Because I think those, in the same way, I think I'm right in saying, Meagan, that the GDPR per se was kind of a blueprint for other locations around the world to follow suit, and lots of the legislation is very similar. I think what the EU is doing maybe is perhaps going to be similar. It's that kind of blueprint for the kind of obligations and things we need to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm working with quite a lot of countries across the world. And actually, when you start looking at their legislation, it's very, very similar. In some have a higher threshold in terms of compliance, and others are broadly similar. So, yeah, we are seeing this go out. But all I'd say is, as I said before, is if you are looking at using this type of technology, etc., is to take it back to basics and think about what are you trying to achieve? How are we doing it? Are we going to cause unhappiness, people complaining, because there's nothing worse than people complaining, particularly if they go to the ICO, because that starts lifting the curtain on your practices, which could result in you know, a non-consensual audit, for example, if they're not happy with what you're proposing to do. So you need to get it right from the outset and thinking about individuals at the center of it.
Just as an aside, this might be of interest. So my cousin Will is the founder of a company called Engineer Arts. So they're a robotics company. They build robots, and their robots are used around the world. So I definitely would recommend people look them up. But the one thing that he always emphasizes, and especially on LinkedIn in his comments, is that quite often he'll comment on the fact that organizations are developing robotics or AI to replace people, but they're for the sake of it, as opposed to there being an actual benefit to so it's not more, it's sometimes less efficient, but it's almost wanting to use these tools for the sake of using them. And I think that goes back to what Meagan's just said there, really, is that think about why you're doing it and what your objectives are. Is it going to improve the quality of what you're doing? Is it going to make it more efficient? So yeah, and I think again, it's that humanoid type thing that people have in mind, I think, with AI. So it's really obviously a fascinating subject, and it's not going away. So it's about how we embrace it and live with it, I guess. So we've mentioned the UK Data Protection and Digital Information Bill briefly throughout today's session, really. So we're going to just focus on it on a bit more depth. Meagan, please jump in at any point. So it's the first change in our data protection regime since leaving the EU, and it revises UK data protection regime, but doesn't replace it as such. It's 2 years since it was laid before Parliament, 2022, and currently, at the time of writing, at the report stage in the House of Lords. And this is one of the government's statements on the purpose, really. So it's about, from their view, being a common sense-led UK version of the EU's GDPR. Pausing there, Meagan. So does that mean that the government potentially doesn't believe that the GDPR in its current form represents common sense, or is it just a selling exercise?
It's an interesting one, because they focus on some of the impacts on small businesses. So, you know, this idea of plumbers being busy beavering away drafting privacy notices rather than going out and fixing taps and stuff like that. So it is tinkering around the edges of the legislation. I don't think there's anything hugely substantial in there. It has though, or will do, remove some of the bureaucracy that smaller organizations have been complaining about. So you know, some of that's probably the right thing to do, actually, in terms of lessening that requirement, because some of it is a bit over the top. But generally speaking, I don't think it's going to change the world substantively.
No, and it's that making sure we differentiate between legislation and doing the right thing and an ethical focus on privacy, isn't it? So this doesn't mean that it changes anything in terms of how we behave and how we run our businesses. But obviously, as the statement goes on, it is focusing on reducing cost and burdens for British businesses and charities. Charities we focused on a lot. I think charities have a very high risk and likelihood of data breach and cyber attacks. So although there's burdens, I think the focus there must be really significant. And potentially removing barriers to international trade. Again, this is not our view. This is the statement of UK government. So, but as Meagan said, from our perspective as a provider of data protection, consultancy and support, we don't believe that our work will change with any significance. It might just mean that we will likely be introducing services around senior responsible individual. Could you maybe sort of talk about that, Meagan, for us?
Yeah, so organizations will be aware that currently, under the current regime, there are certain organizations that they are mandated to have a data protection officer. And that is, broadly speaking, public sector organizations and organizations who are doing large-scale surveillance or processing lots of special category sensitive data, that type of thing. So they are taking away the requirement to have a data protection officer, replacing it with what they are calling a senior responsible individual. And that is where they're requiring organizations to have a named or senior level person, a senior responsible individual who will be responsible for data protection. But this only applies to the same organizations that will have been required to have a data protection officer. So it will be public sector and organizations that are doing high risk processing. So the senior responsible individual is required to be part of the senior level management team, and there's a definition in the legislation of what that actually means. They can delegate their responsibilities in terms of all the data protection requirements, which is essentially the same requirements as you would have had for a data protection officer, but you also can outsource those requirements. So for example, that us as an organization could work collaboratively with that senior level person to help them embed compliance into the organization. So
Yeah.
it's not a huge change, but it does put the focus in on the organization being responsible at a senior level for data protection.
Yeah. I think our support will evolve slightly in terms of, so we will continue to provide high quality data protection advice and guidance to our clients, either on an ad hoc or managed service basis. I think we will be very likely introducing a managed service for senior responsible individuals, but also a mentoring provision, so that we can be there to support and guide those individuals who will hold that role of senior responsible individuals. So it's a case of watch that space really in the next sort of few weeks as we move into the summer, and again, this will very likely become more and more mainstream news. So this will start to pop out, and it will be something that will be reinforced, and it will be in your periphery vision and central vision, I think, for any organization. So please, again, contact us direct if you've got any concerns or worries about what this might mean to you, or how it might impact your organization going forward. We'll do our very best to answer those questions. We've kind of answered that, I think, to some extent, haven't we, in terms of how it will impact UK organizations
Yeah,
and in the
yeah,
coming months?
yeah, absolutely. I'd just probably pick out 3 or 4 things that just for you to go away and think
Yeah.
about. One of the things that's changing is that you will have to deal with complaints locally within your organization first before the ICO will look at them. So now people can just go and complain directly to the ICO, and their complaint will be assessed and looked at, and you'll get a response. But the movement will be towards you resolving that locally within your organization to avoid it going to the ICO. So that's something that potentially will have an impact, because dealing with complaints is never a straightforward thing,
No.
and can be quite time consuming and resource intensive. So that is possibly an impact that will people will have. The other thing, so we talked about direct marketing and consent. The movement, or the requirements or provisions, will mean that political parties and charities may be able to rely on the soft opt-in, which means that they won't necessarily need consent for direct marketing if those individuals have been in touch with them before or supported them or
Okay.
whatever. So that would be a step change for them not having to get consent. What else is there? There's some requirements around record keeping that potentially will go or are likely to go. So a record of processing activities, you won't necessarily have to have one, which it is mandatory now. You won't
Mm.
necessarily have to have one unless you are doing high risk processing.
Yeah.
Um, Data protection impact assessments are slightly changing as well, and they're being called high risk assessments. So you would only have to do it, well, which is actually no real change from now, but it's slightly changed, less provisions in there in terms of what you have to assess as well. So
Yeah.
less
Okay.
burdensome.
Yeah, and each of those subjects, I think, will probably be the sort that would benefit from support from the likes of Moore ClearComm. I think just
Yeah.
in an initial steer, or maybe managing the heavy lifting, because it does. Yeah, these. So I mean, but going back to a record of processing activities, the ROPA. I mean, apart from the legislative requirement, it's a good idea to have one, isn't it? In terms of
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
best practice.
yeah, even if it becomes that your organization doesn't need to have one, in terms of the mandatory requirement,
Yeah.
I would still say you should have a data inventory. You should still know what data you hold, where you hold it, who's responsible for it, how you hold it. Is it paper, electronic? Because if there's an incident, a breach, a request, anything along those lines, that will be really helpful for you to know. And you
Yes.
really should know
Yeah.
as an organization in terms of managing risk, what you hold and how you hold it.
Yeah.
Um,
So at a
so
practical
yeah,
level, yeah, again, it sort of differentiates, doesn't it, between legislative requirement
yeah,
compared to A, best practice, and B, actually making it easier to manage this stuff when things go wrong.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so we've reached that point. We've got about sort of 4 or 5 minutes. So if anyone does have any burning questions, we can check them out now. Again, as we've mentioned before, we'll field every question that's popped in during today's session separately, and we'll provide responses to those questions by way of a document. I know we had so many questions back in August. So you seen anything sort of burning at the moment, Meagan, or
No, it's
no?
and I'm looking at the Q&A tab, and there's no questions coming up at the
Oh,
moment.
okay.
So that's always a good
That's either
thing.
a
We've
good
not.
sign or a bad sign, yeah. But yeah, so again, we did get quite a few after the event. So yeah, so thank you. And our email addresses are there again. So please contact us direct if you have anything specific that we've talked about today that you'd like further elaboration on. So that just leads me to talk about our next webinar, which is going to take place in June. We're going to focus very much on the education sector. So schools under attack, why education is a target. The education sector, whether that's from primary schools all the way up to universities, has a higher likelihood of cyber attack than the average generic business in the UK. So even a primary school is more likely to be attacked than a business in the UK. And that's replicated, I think, in the US as well. So there are specific reasons for that, to which we'll focus on in the session, and that takes place on Thursday, 20th of June. We'll talk about the reasons for the attacks, the timeliness of the attacks, which is very seasonal, so that we know there's certain times of the year that schools are far more likely to be attacked than other times, and the kind of measures that you can put in place to reduce the risk of attack and also to help you manage the circumstance when it happens. And I say when because the kind of stats that are coming out at the moment and evidence, it's extremely likely if you work in an educational environment that you will experience cyber attack and its impact in the next 12 months. Sorry, Meagan, yeah, got a
Got
question?
two questions. Two questions. Can we expect another webinar when the bill is enacted into law? That's something we will consider doing. We will also be offering training sessions around this as well. So
Yeah.
likely, Rich, would you say that we'll do some sort of webinar to
Very
cover
likely,
it?
yeah. And I think the
Yeah.
only reason we haven't scheduled it at the minute is because we don't have that firm timeline. So once, I think what we'll be looking at is probably in the summer months. There'll be very likely we'll be sharing news with everyone that we'll be holding a session for key actions. And I think that wouldn't be the only one. I think there'll be follow-ups to that during the rest of the year into the autumn as well. Very likely.
Okay, and then I've got another question, which is a really good question around equality and diversity data. In terms of an organization, in this case, a charity, can you process that type of information around your staff or your users, for example? Yes, you can. There are exemptions within the legislation, depending on the purpose for collecting that information. As I said, as Rich said, we will get back to attendees with answers to questions. So I will cover
Yeah.
that in an answer in terms of how you can do that and what you can rely on.
Thanks, Meagan. That's brilliant. Yeah, and yeah, so all questions will be covered in depth. So yeah, so the education sector, even I think even if you're not within an education setting, this one would be really interesting to attend, because education is just a really good example of the kind of environment that where a certain sector, because of certain reasons in terms of the nature of the data that it processes, the extensiveness, the way that schools are intertwined, especially when it comes to multi-academy trusts. So think there about your own supply chains and who you're connected to, how things can unravel very quickly. And in every sector, there are specifics that will be catastrophic to an organization in terms of the implications of an attack on you or one of your suppliers. So I think it's, yes, we're going to focus on education, but I think definitely come along to that one for a good general overview of what you might see in your own sector. So I'll be joined by a member of the MKS Moore Kingston Smith education team, which will be fantastic because they can give their insight and experiences of working with the schools and colleges that they support. And I'll also be joined by Paras Shah, one of our fantastic experts from the cybersecurity team. Promises to be a great session. So that one will be advertised very soon, 20th of June. Just remains for me to say thank you to Meagan again for some wonderful insights. I'm sure you'll be very busy responding to questions as we were back in August on this subject. And I hope everyone enjoys a fantastic day. We'll see you all soon. Many thanks. Bye-bye.